I trusted my young sister-in-law to look after my child and asked her to live with me, but she ended up doing something very horrible. I, 34F, am married to my husband, 36M, and we have a 4-year-old daughter named Mila. My husband's job requires him to be away from home for days at a time, while I work a 9-to-5 job. Until recently, my parents were taking care of Mila while we were at work, but I felt guilty about burdening them as they're getting older. My husband's sister, Julia, 22F, lived nearby and worked part-time to cover her rent and expenses. I thought it might be a good solution to ask Julia to move in with us. She could help with Mila, and in return, she wouldn't have to worry about rent anymore. I discussed this with my husband, and he agreed it was a good idea. My husband talked to Julia about our proposal. At first, she declined, but the next evening she called to say she had changed her mind and was willing to move in. We were happy about this arrangement and thought it would work out well for everyone. Julia moved in a few days later, and things seemed to be going smoothly at first. However, after about a week, I started noticing that Mila was acting differently. She seemed hesitant to be around Julia and would often cling to me when Julia was in the room. This was unusual behavior for Mila, who is typically a friendly and outgoing child. I was concerned but didn't want to jump to conclusions. I decided to keep a closer eye on the situation and see if I could figure out what was going on. One day, when my husband was away and Julia had gone out, I sat down with Mila to talk. I asked her gently if everything was okay, and if there was any reason she didn't want to be around Aunt Julia. What Mila told me shocked and horrified me. She said that as soon as I left for work, Julia would put her in her playroom and lock the door from the outside, leaving her alone for hours at a time. Mila said she would cry and call for Julia, but Julia wouldn't come back until just before I was due to return from work. She would give her something to eat and check on her from time to time, but she would keep her locked in the playroom, giving excuses like she is just a child and should stay in her playroom surrounded by her toys. I'm devastated and angry. I can't believe Julia would do something like this to a 4-year-old child. I want to address this immediately, but I'm not sure how to proceed. Part of me wants to confront Julia directly and demand an explanation. Another part of me thinks I should set up a hidden camera to catch her in the act before I say anything. I'm also considering coming home early from work one day without telling Julia, to see if I can catch her neglecting Mila. But I'm worried about what I might find, and how it might affect Mila if she really is being locked up all day. I haven't told my husband yet because I want to be sure before I make such a serious accusation against his sister. But keeping this from him is eating me up inside. I'm torn about what to do next. Should I confront Julia directly? Should I try to gather more evidence first? Should I tell my husband immediately, even though I only have Mila's word to go on? Or should I find a way to stay home for a few days to observe what's happening myself? I'm also worried about the long-term implications. If this is true, I don't think I can ever trust Julia with Mila again. But kicking her out would mean she has nowhere to go, and it could cause a huge rift in the family. On the other hand, if I'm wrong and Julia isn't doing this, I could be damaging my relationship with her for no reason. Maybe Mila misunderstood something or is making it up for attention, but why would she suddenly start acting so afraid of Julia if nothing was wrong? I want to protect my daughter, but I also don't want to accuse Julia of something so serious without being absolutely sure. I'm scared of making the wrong decision and either putting Mila at further risk or unfairly accusing Julia. How should I confront my sister-in-law about this? I'm desperate for advice on how to handle this situation. Update first, I want to thank everyone for their advice on my previous post. After much consideration, I decided to install nanny cams in the common areas of our house to keep an eye on Julia and Mila. I didn't tell anyone about this, not even my husband or Mila. I felt guilty about the secrecy, but I needed to know the truth about what was happening when I wasn't home. The day after I installed the cameras, I pretended to leave for work as usual. Instead, I drove to a nearby mall and settled in at a coffee shop where I could monitor the camera feed on my phone. My heart was racing as I watched the live footage, hoping I was wrong about my suspicions. Unfortunately, my worst fears were confirmed. Shortly after I left, I saw Julia lead Mila to her playroom. She then closed the door and used a small key to lock it from the outside. I felt sick to my stomach watching this. Julia then went to the living room, sat on the couch, and started scrolling through her phone, completely ignoring Mila's calls and cries. I was about to rush home when something even more shocking happened. Julia got up and went to the kitchen's back door. She opened it and let in a hooded man. When he took off his hood, I froze in disbelief. It was Derek, my abusive ex-boyfriend. Seeing Derek brought back a flood of painful memories. We had dated for 2 years when I was in my mid-20s. At first, he was charming and attentive, but his true nature soon emerged. It started with small things, criticizing my clothes, getting jealous when I spent time with friends. Then it escalated to controlling behavior, constant put-downs, and eventually physical abuse. The first time he hit me, he apologized profusely and swore it would never happen again. I believed him, thinking it was a one-time mistake, but the abuse only got worse. He would fly into rages over minor things, throwing objects and shoving me. He isolated me from my friends and family, making me feel like he was all I had. I lived in constant fear, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering his anger. The emotional toll was even worse than the physical abuse. He made me doubt myself, my worth, and my sanity. I felt trapped and hopeless. It took me months to gather the courage to leave him. I moved to a different city and changed my phone number. It was difficult, but I slowly rebuilt my life. I hadn't seen or heard from Derek in years. The thought that he was now in my house, near my daughter, filled me with panic and rage. I watched in horror as Julia and Derek walked into her bedroom together. I couldn't bear to watch anymore. I rushed to my car and sped home, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. How did Derek find me? How long had this been going on? Was Julia involved? With him? Did she know about our history? When I reached home, I used my spare key to enter through the back door as quietly as possible. I could hear muffled sounds coming from Julia's room. My heart was pounding as I approached her door. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. I found Julia and Derek in a state of undress, clearly in the middle of an intimate moment. They both looked up in shock when I entered. Julia scrambled to cover herself while Derek just stared at me, a mix of surprise and something else, maybe amusement, on his face. For a moment, we all just froze, the silence heavy with tension. Then I exploded. I started yelling at Julia, asking how she could do this. How could she neglect Mila, a helpless child, and bring a strange man into our house? I told her she had betrayed our trust in the worst possible way. Then I turned to Derek. All the fear and anger from our past relationship came pouring out. I yelled at him to get out of my house, telling him I would call the police if he ever came near me or my family again. I said I wasn't the same scared girl he used to control and abuse, that I wouldn't let him hurt me or anyone I loved ever again. Derek didn't say much. He just smirked and started getting dressed. Julia was crying and trying to apologize, but I was too angry to listen. I told them both to get out immediately. In the chaos, I suddenly remembered Mila. I rushed to her playroom and unlocked the door. She was huddled in a corner looking scared and confused. I hugged her tightly, apologizing over and over for leaving her alone. I told her everything was going to be okay now. I took Mila to her bedroom and told her to stay there while I dealt with Julia and Derek. When I returned to Julia's room, Derek was gone. He must have slipped out while I was checking on Mila. Julia was fully dressed now, still crying and begging me to let her explain. I was in no mood for explanations. I told Julia she needed to leave our house immediately. She protested, saying she had nowhere to go, but I was adamant. I couldn't trust her around Mila anymore, and I certainly couldn't let her stay after what I'd seen. Once Julia was out of the house, I called my husband. I was shaking as I told him everything. The nanny cams, Julia neglecting Mila, and Derek. He was shocked and furious. He said he would catch the first flight home in the morning. Until then, he told me to lock all the doors and call the police if Derek or Julia tried to come back. After hanging up, I went to check on Mila. She was understandably shaken by everything that had happened. I did my best to comfort her, assuring her that she was safe now and that Aunt Julia wouldn't be looking after her anymore. I felt terrible for putting her through this ordeal. As the adrenaline wore off, the full weight of the situation hit me. I was overwhelmed with a mix of emotions: anger at Julia and Derek, fear about what could have happened, guilt for not realizing sooner what was going on, and worry about what to do next. I spent a restless night, constantly checking on Mila and jumping at every little sound. I couldn't stop thinking about Derek. How had he found me? Was he planning to come back? The idea that he knew where I lived now terrified me. The next morning, my husband arrived home. We had a long emotional conversation about everything that had happened. He was supportive and angry on my behalf, but also shocked that his sister could behave this way. We agreed that Julia couldn't be trusted to live with us anymore, but we were unsure about how to handle the situation with the rest of the family. We also discussed what to do about Derek. My husband wanted to go to the police immediately, but I was hesitant. I wasn't sure if they could do anything since he hadn't explicitly threatened me. Plus, the idea of having to recount our abusive relationship to strangers was daunting. In the end, we decided to consult with a lawyer before making any decisions. As for Mila, we agreed she needed to see a child therapist to help her process what had happened. We also decided to look into different childcare options, possibly a professional nanny or a reputable daycare center. It's been a few days since all this happened, and I'm still trying to process everything. I feel betrayed by Julia and angry at myself for not realizing what was happening sooner. The reappearance of Derek in my life has brought up a lot of old trauma that I thought I had dealt with. I'm also worried about the fallout with my husband's family. We haven't told them the full story yet, just that Julia is no longer living with us due to issues with childcare. I'm dreading having to explain everything, especially the part about Derek. My husband has been incredibly supportive through all of this. He's taken time off work to be home with us and has been helping me look into security measures for our house. We're considering moving, but that feels like such a drastic step. Mila seems to be doing okay, all things considered. She's been clingy and has had some trouble sleeping, but she's also shown remarkable resilience. Her first session with the therapist is scheduled for next week. I haven't heard from Julia since I kicked her out. Part of me feels guilty for putting her out on the street, but a larger part is still too angry to care. I keep replaying the camera footage in my mind, seeing her lock my daughter away like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. As for Derek, there's been no sign of him. I'm torn between hoping he's gone for good and fearing that he's out there, planning his next move. I've been jumping at shadows and struggling to sleep, always half expecting him to show up. I know we have a long road ahead of us. There are still so many unanswered questions and decisions to be made. How do we explain this to the rest of the family? Should we press charges against Julia for child neglect? How do we ensure Mila feels safe and secure again? And how do I deal with the resurfaced trauma from my relationship with Derek? For now, we're taking it one day at a time. Our main focus is on Mila's well-being and making sure our home is safe. We're also looking into legal options and considering therapy for myself to deal with the reemergence of Derek in my life. I want to thank this community again for your support and advice. It gave me the courage to take action and potentially saved my daughter from further neglect or worse. If anyone has been through a similar situation or has advice on how to move forward, I would greatly appreciate it. This whole experience has left me feeling vulnerable and unsure, but I'm determined to stay strong for my family.